Because if the words are landing in the right place and hypothetically emanating from the proper source, then there's silence. And sometimes that silence can be dramatic, and that's why people say, well, you could have heard a pin drop. It's no one's moving, because their attention is 100% gripped by whatever just happened. And one thing that reliably elicited that was the proposition that the meaning that sustains you and protects you from corruption during suffering is to be found in responsibility. And people that, and I thought part of the reason that produced silence was because no one says that now. They say happiness, or they say rights, or they say privileges, or they say reward, or something like that. They don't say pick up the heaviest load you can carry and care for that matter, and stumble forward. And I've seen people cut those ideas and put them on t-shirts and play with them. And so it's not that the church is asking too little of its people.
No, it is asking too little of them. I quite agree.
It's precisely, and so there's no heroism in it. There's no call to.
Well, because finally, I call it the culture of self-invention is a very boring culture. Stanley Hauerwas is a Methodist theologian who said he defined liberalism, or the modern attitude, as I have no story except the story I invent for myself. And that's finally a very boring place to live, it seems to me. In fact, you're part of this incredibly rich and complex narrative, which I would refer to as God's creation and God's providential movement. But I go back to Luke's gospel, when Jesus says to them, Duc in altum is it the Latin way, go out into the depths. You people have been horsing around in the shallows way too long. That's where the fish are, by the way. But also it's where adventure is. It's where the glory of life is. Get out into the depth. And we have, I think, allowed our people to be kind of horsing around by the seashore all the time.
It's also where what protects you from hell is. Because you need to be engaged in something that's deeply meaningful enough to justify the suffering. And so, part of what happens in the story of Christ is the only thing deep enough to justify that level of suffering is absolute immersion in a cosmic drama. And then you ask yourself, well, are we each immersed in a cosmic drama? And it's not so easy to say no to that. It's a life or death situation, and everything's in it.
Well, and I would say the instinct of a Christian is to go where the suffering is. So I spent a lot of my life forming priests, so working in the seminary. Eventually, I was the rector of the seminary. So my job was to help these young guys discern the priesthood. And I would say that's the test. I mean, do you have an instinct to go where the pain is, to go where the suffering is? If you want to live a comfortable life, then don't become a priest. You might be a bad priest, if you embrace a comfortable life, but it's the Mother Teresa model. It's the Duc in altum. Go out into the depths, and the depths mean the depth of human suffering.
So then what's wrong with what you guys are doing? Why isn't it working? Well, what's the problem?
It's true that we're not doing enough of that. And I do think we've succumbed a bit to the modern thing, which is a preoccupation with rights and freedom and my individuality and so on.
Well, you see this with church activism so much now, is that so like the church seems to be replacing itself in some sense with social activism. It's like we've got enough social activists.
Yes. Well, but see, I'd say this. Pope Benedict XVI, who's a great intellectual hero of mine, said the church always does three essential things. The church worships God, it evangelizes, and it cares for the poor. Poor broadly construed, as I say, anyone who's suffering, right? But that first move, as we said earlier, is indispensable. The church worships God. It teaches the world right praise, because without right praise, the whole thing falls apart. Secondly, it evangelizes. What's that? Well, that's a cool thing too, because euangelion in Greek, good news. They were playing with that because the Romans would have used that in the eastern part of the empire to announce an imperial victory. They would send an evangelist ahead with the good news. Euangelion, hey, Caesar won a victory. So these very edgy first Christians who had zero social status, no power, no military behind them said, oh, no, I got the true Euangelion. It's about Jesus risen from the dead, who was put to death by Caesar, but whom God raised. So that's the proclamation of the good news, that now we have hope. Now the sacrifice has been made, and God's love is greater than anything that's in the world. Okay, now I got those two things in place. Now serve the poor. Now go where the pain is, go where the suffering is. But if you divorce them from each other, and that has happened. So who cares about worship? And that's fussing around with altars and sacristies. And who cares about evangelization? Let's just get down and serve the poor. Then it does devolve simply into social work, right? But if the three are together, worship God, evangelize the dying and rising of Jesus, and serve the poor, now the church is cooking, you know?
All right, so let's look at the second one of those. So,
Yeah.
you know, it seems to me, I can understand this, not that whether I can understand it or not is a hallmark of its validity, but I have to try to understand what I can understand. I can understand the idea that bearing forward in a moral direction, acting as if being is intrinsically good and that humanity as part of that is also intrinsically good, bearing all that up as a set of propositions, even in the most extreme cases of suffering, I can see that as a valid moral good. That's Christ's refusal to be, what would you say, corrupted by the injustice of his and terror of his fate. And so that might be something like, you don't have the right to become a tyrant no matter how badly you were tyrannized, let's say.
Yeah.
And I think that's an unshakable moral proposition. But then there's the resurrection element of it, because I could say, well, the first thing I would say is, well, I kind of understand that psychologically. Parts of us die, and they have to die because they're in error. They have to be cast off, and we're reborn constantly as a consequence of our movement, our ascent forward. There's no movement forward without some death of the past. And so I can see the resurrection idea as a metaphor for the part of us that continues onward despite our failures and constantly reconstitutes our spirit. It's not something trivial, but then there's the insistence in the church of the bodily resurrection, which is, well, let's call that a stumbling block to modern belief. No doubt about that. That's something more than mere metaphor. And so you might ask, well, why is it insisted upon? Why isn't the proposition that you have a transcendent moral obligation to bear, to operate for the good of all things, regardless of your suffering, a hard line, no justification with the defeat of death necessitated? I'm not trying to make a fundamental critique of the idea of the resurrection, because I know there are things that I don't know. I know that for sure. And God only knows how the world is fundamentally structured. But it seems, and this is a Nietzschean criticism in some